All right, so you wanted to unpack this whole thing with Venezuelan gangs popping up in the U.S., right?
Yeah, it's definitely been on my radar.
So we thought, what better place to start than with podcast D and Danny?
Oh, yeah, I heard of that one.
Yeah, he's got a huge following, and he did this whole episode on, well, you guessed it.
Venezuelan gangs.
Exactly. I mean, it's one thing to hear about it in passing, but he really, digs into the nitty-gritty.
I bet.
Yeah, and one of the things he kept coming back to is how much this is blowing up in the U.S. media lately,
Which is kind of a big deal, right?
Totally, because it means people are finally starting to pay attention. And
they're not just everyday people, but policymakers, law enforcement, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. And you know what's interesting? He actually mentioned this LA Times article talking about how police departments all over the country are starting to share information about these gangs, like intelligence and stuff.
Wow.
Which, if you think about it...
that says something.
Totally.
Yeah.
It means they're taking it seriously,
For sure.
So, one of the questions you had was, how did these gangs even end up in the U.S.?
Right, yeah.
And Danny, he traces some of them back to Caracas, which makes sense.
The capital.
Yeah, exactly.
Makes sense.
But here's the thing. They're not just sticking to, Miami or L.A.
All right.
He was talking about how they're in, Charlotte, North Carolina.
Really?
Charlotte. I mean, it's like they're everywhere.
It's like they saw an opportunity.
Totally. And, think about it. You've got this economic crisis in Venezuela. People are desperate.
Looking for a better life.
Exactly. And then they get here. And it's not always what they expected,
It's that disconnect, right? The American dream isn't always what it's cracked up to be.
Exactly. And I think that's part of what these gangs exploit,
That vulnerability.
Yeah. And then you add in the language barrier, lack of jobs. It's like a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about the violence.
Right. And Danny does not shy away from that at all.
He shouldn't.
He talks about these turf wars in Miami, Houston.
Yeah.
And it's just brutal. But what really got me was this story he told about this shopkeeper in Houston.
Oh, no.
Totally innocent, just caught in the crossfire.
It's heartbreaking because it goes beyond the gangs themselves,
Exactly. And I think that's why it's so important that we're talking about this, because it affects everyone.
For sure. It's a community issue.
Totally. So another thing you were asking about is, why would someone join a gang in the first place?
Right. What drives them to that?
And it's complicated, but Danny talks about how for some of these kids, it's a sense of belonging.
Belonging.
Yeah, they come here, they don't speak the language, they don't have any support systems.
They're isolated.
Exactly. And the gang becomes like their family.
It's a twisted kind of family.
Totally. But it gives them a sense of purpose,
Yeah, I can see that.
And then he brings on this criminologist, Dr. Ana Rodriguez.
Okay, what's she have to say?
So she had this really interesting take. She said, these gangs are basically filling a void left by the government.
Interesting. How so?
They're providing basic necessities, even a sense of justice in these communities where the system has failed them.
Wow, so it's more complex than just, these kids are bad or something.
Exactly. It's systemic.
Totally. And she was saying that we can't just arrest our way out of this problem.
We have to address the root causes.
Exactly.
Provide resources.
And that's where these organizations come in.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So Danny ended the episode by highlighting these amazing groups that are working directly with at-risk youth.
That's awesome.
Providing education, job training, counseling, the whole 9 yards.
It's like they're throwing lifelines.
Exactly. And I think that's where the hope lies,
In the grassroots.
Yeah, because a real change happens from the ground up, right?
Absolutely. And it's about empowering these communities.
Totally. And I think the biggest takeaway for me from Danny's episode is that we can't forget that behind every headline, every statistic, are real people.
Exactly.
With real stories.
And if we want to find solutions, we need to listen to those stories.
We need to understand their struggle.
And then, and only then, can we start to make a difference.
I completely agree. It's about empathy and action.